they did the fire in Bambi was Jimmy McDonald crushing strawberry baskets into a microphone. And at that distance, it sounds like a mighty oak falling. And he also happened to be a terrific voice actor. He was the voices of Jacques and Gus in Cinderella. And he was the little voice of the Dormouse.
Now where did he go to?
The Mad Tea Party is one of the strongest and most memorable sequences in the movie. The animation of the characters, the voices, the comedy, everything is working for a splendidly absurd moment that still captures much of the spirit of Carol's original. In contrast, the Tulgey Wood sequence that follows is much more loosely based, although there are some connections to his most famous poem, Jabberwocky.
'Twas brillig, and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the momraths outgrave. A stanza later in the poem is what inspired the Disney artists to create the Tulgey Wood. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the Tulgey Wood and burbled as it came.
No, please. No more thoughts.
The poem is called Jabberwocky, but the animal is a Jabberwock.
The Jabberwock itself does not appear in the Disney film, although the Cheshire Cat recites the first verse of the poem.
The poem appears in Through the Looking Glass, but it wasn't written many, many years before. We have a record of it in one of the family domestic magazines, and he writes it out backwards at one point. It is mirror writing, you see.
Lewis Carroll once described that many of the creatures in Jabberwocky actually had physical reality for him. For him, a rat was some sort of a green pig.
Originally, when they were writing their script, they thought that Alice might encounter a real threat in the Tulgey Wood in the form of a Jabberwock beast that is somewhat threatening to her. It turns out to be somewhat comical.
But there was a very funny series of offbeat, very stylized 1950s kind of storyboards done in pastel of Jabberwocky. And the Jabberwock, in this case, is a sort of strange pantomime dragon. Sort of like something out of a vaudeville show with, you can see little people's legs coming out from under a cloth and this big crazy mask and a big, Jabberwocky head with wild hair and goggle eyes. And would have made a very, very entertaining sequence.
I shall certainly be glad to get out of it.
They had hired Stan Freberg, a very popular comic, to do the voice of the Jabberwock. But at this point, Walt decided, again, that they really shouldn't get too far away from the story of a little girl who goes to a fantasy world.
They probably had a toss-up as to whether they were going to do Jabberwocky and the Walrus and the Carpenter. Happily, they went with Walrus, although I would have loved to see Jabberwocky.
It would be so nice if something would make sense for a change.
At one point, they talked about including the White Knight from Through the Looking Glass in the film.
This bumbling character with all his paraphernalia and his horse falling off at every opportunity, telling long, rambling, strange poems, making little jests, a kind of Don Quixote type knight.
The White Knight is one of the few characters who is genuinely kind to Alice when he meets her, and he was going to be a partial caricature of Walt, which is interesting because many Carroll scholars believe the White Knight was Carroll's kind of self-caricature, that he put himself into the knight more than into any of the other characters that he created.
The description where Dodson writes about Alice leaning against the tree in the setting sun, watching the night as he sits there singing his song and then riding off into the sunset, is quite clearly a saying goodbye. I think by that time, Lewis Carroll wasn't saying goodbye to Alice Liddell. I think he was saying goodbye to this Alice child that he and she had created.
Let me get out.
Walt Disney said he tried to convince the animators to introduce the White Knight because it would have brought an emotional core to the picture, because Alice could have related to the White Knight and that would have given it heart and soul.
But that was one of the sequences that never made it into the film.
Walt decided that he would use the Tulgey Wood in the film to try to make Alice a more sympathetic character. So at this point, she becomes lost and frightened and riddled with this regret that she should have listened to the advice that she'd given herself earlier and to not follow the rabbit. And so she sits down on a rock and cries and sings a rather pathetic song, and it's a real low point in the film.
That explains the trouble that I'm always in.
The book, the author used words to amuse himself. And in The Tulgey Woods, I think you see the artist find ways visually to invent in order to amuse the audience.
This isn't something that's in the book. This is something that the Disney animators created to the spirit of the book.
The Tulgey Wood sequence is one of the interesting ones because there the artists really start conceiving of animals and creatures that have no basis in nature. It's not like the white rabbit or the dodo or things that were really there. These are just complete creatures of fancy.
You have a moment almost like in Snow White where the little critters all come up as she's sitting there. But unlike Snow White, where the critters come up and touch her, and she is comforted by their presence, these critters, they cry, they feel for her, but they disappear.
Will I ever learn to do the things I should?
And the only one that comes back to her to actually help her is the Cheshire Cat.
Oh, Cheshire Cat, it's